Really, my approach to this work is very holistic. So I don't see sexuality as something that can be isolated from the rest of who we are. It all starts with our relationship with self and branches out from there. And because we are made of sexual energy, it's literally how we were created and got here in these bodies. It's so woven into every piece of creation. It's not just this act that happens between the sheets behind closed doors, right? It is the vitality, the life force that permeates everything in existence. So my approach is very holistic of really looking at where does this tie into every area of our life, and seeing sex, the act of sex, when we're having issues there, it's usually symptomatic of something else. There's some sort of psychological blockage or trauma, or some sort of belief systems or communication breakdowns in a relationship that can be blocking the flow of that current of energy that is always present, permeating all of life.
Awesome. Now, Soraya, I found you on Facebook and we talked a little bit about this. I saw your, I think it was an advertisement, some of your ad copy. And so the reason, and this is for the readers and also for you, the reason that I was drawn to you is because I noticed that your ad copy was just very focused on men's issues, and which I'm very passionate about, obviously. And, in dating and human mating behavior is really where I get excited. And so when I saw kind of the things we're talking about and the things that you were, and I can't even remember the exact topic of that particular thing because I've seen so many of your posts and I always find them interesting. And so the reason I wanted to have you on is because I think in our culture, we have this weird disconnect between like real life and sexuality. And in some ways, we've never been more sexually liberated. And this is so readily apparent to me. And it's so obviously an area where so many humans struggle. So because we have like this sexualized advertisements everywhere and everyone is all over Instagram, and then we have like magazine covers, it's so glamorized. However, I also think we've never been more sexually repressed, to be honest. Like so many people are so lost and don't know how to navigate it or what to do. And so what do you think about that? Like, would you agree with that statement?
You are so right in that. It's a very strange paradox. I mean, we are simultaneously stretched between these repressive puritanical roots, which are not so far off in our history, like, in the Western world. Like, that's still pretty recent. We've only really had this kind of sexual liberation happening over the past 50 plus years or so. And then in other countries, still extremely, extremely repressed. But then, yeah, we've got the porn industry, we've got the marketing realm of sex sells. And it's very strange because it's very accessible in certain ways, but real education around sexuality that is actually helpful and coming from a place of authenticity is very rare. I mean, what we learn in school typically is abstinence or don't get pregnant, or I know some more progressive schools do a little bit better with it. But yeah, I mean, unless we have parents that are very deeply connected to their sexuality and have a healthy relationship with it and feel comfortable sharing that with us, most of us have just kind of been fumbling in the dark trying to figure it out. And, so much of what we see of it is performance based, what we see in the movies or porn, and it's often not very realistic. And so then we see that and we kind of get this idea of what sex is supposed to look like. And we don't actually, especially for our generation, I think, growing up on internet porn and this sort of thing, it's pretty interesting to think about. Before that existed, we probably never really saw anyone have sex ever, unless maybe we walked in on our parents or our brother and sister or something. But now, before we get the opportunity to touch in with our own sexual energy for the first time, we've already seen it portrayed to us in this certain kind of way through a screen. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a simultaneous huge repression and disconnection, but then this flaunting of it that can be so confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting that you mentioned porn because I've often been fascinated with this topic in the sense there's a big conversation about whether it's good for us, whether it's bad for us. In fact, I just watched a podcast. Do you listen to the Michaela Peterson podcast at all?
Oh, I haven't.
Okay, so she just did an interesting podcast where she had someone who was pro porn, kind of like a scientist, and then she's someone who was really against it, who's basically an advocate for, I can't remember exactly which which not for profit she was for, but basically they were kind of debating the merits of it. And it's just such a massive, massive question. However, I can't help but to feel like this is also a cultural question, and we haven't learned how to deal with it yet. So like we're still trying to figure out how to acclimate to a situation where it's so readily, like you said, readily accessible. Most of us before the internet, like, I don't know, like I remember a time when there was no internet when I was very, very young, and so like it's like unheard of. Like you would have had to jump through so many hoops as like a 6 or 7 year old to actually see someone, do that. And so it wasn't even, I didn't even operate at that same level. Whereas nowadays, like, I mean, I don't know, but there's probably not very many middle schoolers who haven't watched porn, right? Which is like so kind of mind boggling to me. And so it's like, is it doing damage? Is it like, is the damage very bad? Is it not bad? These are questions that I'm often fascinated with. But one thing about porn that a lot of people talk about is, well, porn is kind of like sex education. Like it helps us to acclimate more to it, and it makes it less of a stigma. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I have my own kind of thoughts about that, and the scientists have their own kind of thoughts about that. However, on the topic of sex education, that is a very important topic. And in fact, I had a question that I wanted to ask you. And your work as a sexual relationship coach, you say you help men and women. However, I have it seems like a lot of what you do is geared toward helping men who obviously need help in this day and age, because it seems to me like a lot of the men I work with and that I talk to, almost they hit this catch-22. They try to have good relationships. They want intimacy. They want sex. They want to have a girlfriend or a wife or whatever. However, they're kind of expected to go into it as this like experienced, knowledgeable, powerful man when, in a sexual way, when they've maybe never experienced it before, or maybe they've never had a win, or the wins they've had have been few and far between, and they've had many more, losses or defeats than that. And so that can really put a man in a position where he's fighting an uphill battle, kind of not only psychologically, but also just in his life, in a confidence sense, in a sense of like his status with his own self, right? And so is that in any way tied into the work you do? And like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, wow, yeah, this is such a big topic. As far as porn goes, it's not inherently bad, in my opinion. Actually,
sure, yeah.
A lot of the work that I do is rooted in Tantra, which is an ancient holistic approach to life and spirituality that originates in ancient India. And in Tantra, there's a belief that, everything is sacred. It all comes from the same source. It's all one. And so nothing can be less sacred than anything else. It's kind of all paths stemming from and leading to the same action, the same source. Yeah. So, I don't think that porn is like inherently bad. I do think that the way that it's being produced and the way it's being consumed can be extremely problematic. And for several reasons. First of all, it's almost never an authentic connection between people who actually share sexual attraction, and are not doing it from a place of like, oh, we're putting on a show here, but rather like, this is the authentic expression of our sexual connection. I think that could be much more useful for people to see, rather than like, oh, I'm supposed to have a 10-inch cock and I'm supposed to just like jackhammer, and there's no real intimacy because you've got to get the hands out of the way so that you can get the camera to these like, super close up genital angles and this sort of thing. It's all very unnatural. And it can create.
To your point, I just want to jump in there because I feel like you'll probably be able to say something about this too. My big fear about porn in men, and it's true with women as well, but I think it's a lot more true with men, is that what you said is exactly true. It's usually not portraying like a true connection, but there's especially no connection between the man and the people he's observing having that sexual experience, right? So it's like a completely voyeuristic experience, and there's no human connection in it, which to me is the biggest danger. Like that's the biggest problem, I think. Anyway, continue. Go ahead.
That's a great point, Josh. It does lead to greater objectification and just disconnection.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's the thing about porn, is it puts sex very in our heads. It becomes a very visual experience. As you said, we have sex with our bodies. We need to be embodied while we have sex. If we're like off in our heads thinking about something we saw in porn and we're playing out some script in our head of like, this is how we've seen it done, we think this is kind of the linear order that things evolve in, we're completely missing point. We're not present to this moment and this person. And we're playing out this idea of what we think sex is rather than letting it unfold as it wants to in each moment.
Absolutely.
And so I think, yeah, that's a big problem with it. And then, you know, you've got your brain gets flooded with dopamine and thinks that it's already achieved the reward that it's after, and that you don't actually need to put in the work to go find a lover or court someone, or you're also not training yourself to have any sort of stamina or presence in your body because you're just pushing a button, often getting off as quickly as you can. It's actually training you to come very quickly, and to be very visually stimulated. And oftentimes this will lead to not being able to get turned on by a real person, and your tolerance level gets higher and higher to where you need more extreme things to arouse you. So I mean, I've seen things with men with very extreme porn addiction who, you know, they can't even get an erection anymore. They're still jerking it to porn like 4 or 5 times a day, but they can't get hard. And it can take up to 9 months of no porn for that erection strength to return to its fullness. So there's very physical effects it can have. And I think when we're watching porn from a very young age, we still have this very high neuroplasticity, and we are developing a connection to our sexual energy for the first time, this can get so deeply seated. And oftentimes what will happen is the body is having a sexual response to what we're seeing, but mentally we might not even feel like in alignment with what we're watching. It might be kind of gross on some level, like, oh, this doesn't actually feel like what I want to see, but my body's responding with some arousal, and it kind of creates these crossing of wires and this confusion. So this is where a lot of kind of that shame can come in, or feeling unfulfilled after coming, and kind of like, what was all that about? Like, why did I just do that again? I actually don't feel so great after. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so with all that being said, what do you think as far as like men learning to actually, you know, connect to sex in a healthy way? Like how should men start that process? You know, how do they learn to become a sexually, you know, fulfilled, sexually powerful, maybe even sexually, let's use the term, I think, trying to give the best term, sexually connected with themselves in a healthy way? Like what's your advice to men in that sense?
Well, I really like how you said that, Josh, of how to be sexually connected to themselves in a healthy way, because that really is where it starts. And a lot of us are projecting our connection with our sexual energy onto other people. Like, we forget that we even have that relationship to nurture within ourselves. And it can feel like, oh, somebody else has to get me off or get me turned on, or I need a lover to be able to explore this in a deep and meaningful way. And it's not true. It's really powerful to cultivate this really beautiful relationship with our own sexual energy, to be able to fill our own cup and explore our own bodies and know what we like. And unfortunately, yeah, there's not a lot out there for, you know, especially like kids coming into puberty and stepping into their sexual energy for the first time. They often don't have a place to look or turn to for that. And, you know, that's definitely one of my life goals, to kind of change that. But as adults, you know, listening to this podcast and some things that you can explore is having a self-pleasure practice that is not goal-oriented, where you are coming into it with curiosity and playfulness and openness and intention rather than agenda. So, you know, an agenda, a goal is like this target that we're trying to hit. We're chasing that orgasm. And when we're so obsessed with the destination, we're completely missing the journey. And we can get in these habitual ways of, well, this is the way that I do it that gets the job done, instead of what is my body fully capable of feeling if I give it the time and the space, and I touch myself in ways that maybe I normally don't, and I slow down and I breathe. And so an intention is more like, I'm going to choose to be present this whole time. I'm going to stay present with my breath. I want to just remain curious and open. It's kind of like a little seed that we're planting and then allowing to blossom as it will. And I think that's really important to take into our sexual connection with another person too. We can often emphasize orgasm as like the most important thing that determines the success of sex, but we can have orgasms and still not feel fulfilled, still not feel connected. And ultimately, I think, we all want something very deeply fulfilling and connective that also involves amazing pleasure and orgasms. But the over focus on the orgasm can actually get in the way and cloud all the different textures that want to come through the experience. Even having the goal of like, I'm going to give you an orgasm to your lover. I mean, that can sound like a very well-intentioned thing, but then it puts a lot of pressure on both of you. If they're not having that orgasm, you're wondering like, what am I doing wrong? And they're thinking, oh shit, I better have an orgasm soon or they're going to think they're doing something wrong.
Actually, that's a very practical thing, and it's real. Like that's a real world thing, super practical. And it's so funny to hear you say that.